Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. These town halls have been a wonderful opportunity for so many partners and stakeholders to come together and address practice issues. And I'm really excited to facilitate the discussion today on serving LGBTQ youth in child welfare. My name is Kristen Melton, and I'm the Youth Services Manager at the Division of Child Welfare. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping and a few reminders. One, the town hall counts as training hours, and it's recorded and archived for people who couldn't attend to still access later. Also, just to note, the topics that we discuss are not necessarily policy directives, but it's an opportunity for the panelists to share perspectives and participants as well. We really hope this can be an engaging discussion, including participants as much as possible. And I encourage you to type your thoughts or questions in the chat, or you can raise hand or type raise hand if you'd like to speak, and we can unmute you. This topic that we are addressing today comes at an unprecedented time in our country. The wave of protests and demonstrations over the past several weeks have prompted a national awakening of the depth and severity of racism in our country. It is also Pride Month, and Pride demonstrations around the country have been integrating with and showing support for Black Lives Matter. We've also had two landmark Supreme Court decisions this week. Today, the court blocked the DACA program from abruptly ending, which allows the Dreamers to stay in the United States. And a few days ago, the court ruled a person cannot be fired from their job because they are gay or transgender. So with this as our backdrop, I am so happy to introduce to you our panelists and to share a discussion about how we in child welfare can support children and youth who are LGBTQ. So I will start with Marv Allen, who is the One Colorado Health and Equity Training Director. Marvin uses pronouns he, him, and they, them. And he is the Health Equity and Training Director for One Colorado. And Marvin has previously worked with Denver County Child Welfare and has a passion for supporting LGBTQ youth in care. Marv, do you want to talk a little bit about One Colorado?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for inviting me here. I'm so happy to be here with all of the panelists today. One Colorado is the state's leading advocacy organization for LGBTQ Coloradans and their families. And so we work on all sorts of levels from statewide policy. We've recently had some wins as well with the gay and trans panic defense ban, as well as some PrEP legislation to make PrEP more accessible. And so we work at that level at the state legislature, but we also do a lot of trainings around the community, a lot of data collection, which I'll talk a little bit about some of our data. And then we also have a youth in schools program and work really closely with GSAs around the state.
Cool, thank you so much, Marv. Next on our panel, we have Theo. Theo, I should have asked you how to pronounce your last name before we started in all of that prep time. Can you help me out?
Of course, it's Isis.
Isis, thank you. Theo Isis, who uses pronouns they, them, theirs, and works for the Colorado Sexual Health Initiative as their training specialist. Theo is a sex educator with the Colorado Sexual Health Initiative at CDHS. They love finding innovative ways to make sure that young people have the information, skills, self-knowledge, and access to resources to make lifelong sexual health decisions for themselves. Theo, would you like to talk a little bit about COSHI and what that is and what you do?
Absolutely, yeah. So COSHI is under the Office of Children, Youth, and Families. We're just the really small group next to child welfare and youth services. And we try to work with folks in CDHS and in the counties to provide sexual health education and access to resources for young people who are involved in human services. So if you are in a situation or in a setting where you feel like young people could use more information about sexual health, or caseworkers could use more information about talking to young people about sexual health, reach out to us because we'd love to work with you to make sure that young people get that information.
Great, thank you so much. We had COSHI move onto our floor not too long before we all got booted out of the building. So it was nice to have you join us, and then we all dispersed. All right, so next we have KP Longton, who uses pronouns she, her, and hers. KP currently serves as the currently serves Adams County foster parents by onboarding them with training and coaching. KP is a co-leader of the Adams County All Children, All Families Project Steering Committee, which was developed by the Human Rights Campaign. Additionally, KP has volunteered as a therapist at the Gender Identity Center of Colorado and is a passionate supporter of the LGBTQ community members and their families. KP, would you like to talk a little bit about Adams County and the seal, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So Adams County is pretty committed to becoming more inclusive and diverse. And part of that is our Child Welfare Division pairing with the Human Rights Campaign for the All Children, All Families Project, which of course the state also did, and a few other agencies within Colorado as well. And we paired with them to make some changes within our practice and our forms. And we're still working on a few pieces of that. But we started in 2017, and then in 2019 we did receive the highest level seal of inclusion from the HRC, and then we also just got the announcement a few weeks ago that we were renewed for the same seal for 2020. So that was pretty exciting news for us.
Okay, thank you so much. Next on our panel, we have Nicole Drake, who uses pronouns she, her, and hers. And Nicole is the Child Welfare Youth Services Specialist. Nicole has worked with young people exclusively for most of her career, including working in a detention facility as an emergency after-hours caseworker and as an adolescent intake caseworker focused on crossover youth. Nicole is passionate about supporting county caseworkers and serving older youth and believes all youth should have the opportunity to fully realize the promise of adolescence. Nicole, is there anything you wanted to add?
You know, not a lot. I'm really excited to be here with this great group of individuals and really proud of all the work that they're doing to further services for LGBTQ plus youth.
Thank you. And finally, last but definitely not least, Pearl Bell, who uses pronouns she, her, and hers. Pearl is the Youth Development Specialist in the Division of Child Welfare. And Pearl has worked on several inclusivity initiatives, including the Division of Child Welfare's All Children, All Families project for LGBTQ best practices in child welfare. Additionally, Pearl is a Georgetown University Fellow in the Supporting LGBTQ Youth in Care program. Pearl, did you want to add anything?
No, I'm just really pleased that this panel has come together. The state has also received this innovative seal both in 2019 and in 2020. So we're very excited again to be honored with that. And as KP mentioned, I think it's an ongoing process where we continue to make new strides in this area. And this panel is just one of the things we're doing. So thank you.
Great, thanks. So we've got a great panel today, and they're excited to have this dialogue. While the panelists are responding to questions, I invite you as participants to enter your thoughts in the chat so we can bring your experiences and ideas into the conversation. I'm going to go ahead and jump in with questions, and again, feel free to just type in the chat and questions or comments, and I will try to keep an eye on that and bring you in as you type. So I'm going to start with Shoji. So the question is, what is Shoji? It's an acronym, SOGIE, and why should child welfare professionals be concerned about it when working with children, youth, and families? Start with Mara Fair.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So I'll just start with, some of the basics about SOGI. So SOGI stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And so that's how we get SOGIE. It's really important to recognize that we all have a sexual orientation, a gender identity, and a gender expression. So we will talk a lot today about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, and queer or LGBTQ people in the community. But under this umbrella exist labels that describe sexual orientation and labels that describe gender identity and gender expression. And so sexual orientation is a person's emotional, romantic, and sexual attraction to other people based on other people's gender. People may identify as bisexual, gay, heterosexual, lesbian, or something else. And then gender identity is one's deeply rooted understanding of their own gender. And so one really important thing is we all get to say what our own gender identity is. No one else can tell us what our deeply rooted understanding of our own gender is. And gender expression is the way a person is reflecting and expressing their gender to the outside world. This can be things like mannerisms, the way we dress, or just the way we present different gendered parts about ourselves. I think that the question on why should child welfare professionals be concerned about Shoji is really important. And when I was thinking about this ahead of time, I had a million things, so I did pare it down a little bit. But I think it's really important because it's part of who we are. It's part of who they are. It's part of who their families are. It's not all of it by any means, but this should not be the only thing that child welfare professionals are aware of. We're talking a lot about race now in a way that we should have been talking about it for a long time. And so that's going to be one of those things that intersect with our gender identity and more things that we need to be aware of as we're working with children and families. Let me make sure I'm at my spot. So, but there is some really important data that shows that children who are in affirming homes and communities just do better all around in so many areas. For example, the Human Rights Campaign 2018 LGBTQ Youth Report shows us that 48% of LGBTQ youth out to their parents say their families make them feel bad for being LGBTQ. And I don't think that I have to tell anybody listening to this call the impact that that shame can bring to our mental, behavioral, and physical wellness. And it's also important to notice the different experiences children and young people have with their families based on their sexual orientation versus their gender identity. For example, trans youth are 2 times more likely to be taunted or mocked within their families than lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer youth are. And again, these are things that have real impacts on our children. We know from One Colorado's data report in 2018, Closing the Gap, the turning point for LGBTQ health, that LGBTQ Coloradans are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety and depression than folks who do not identify as LGBTQ. And of course, as we go further down in that data, the rates are even higher for trans and non-binary folks. The rates are even higher for people of color. They're even higher for people in low-income situations. And so those are really important things to think about as we're thinking about our community, that our community is really diverse and these things are gonna impact it. And so then I'll just say those negative outcomes are direct results of living with discrimination, violence, and fear. It's not because there's something inherently wrong with being LGBTQ. It's because we are too often placed or living or placed into living in unaffirming homes and in an unaffirming world. And so I actually think that child welfare professionals should not only be concerned about LGBTQ children, youth, and families in their work, but ethically should be concerned about this in the world and fighting for legislation and policy and fighting for new things. Last year we just passed Jude's Law in Colorado that changed a lot of the laws around for everybody, but it helped a minor be able to change their gender markers a lot easier with one guardian or parent instead of 2, and things like that are really going to help improve the impacts of LGBTQ.
Thank you so much, Marv. So on the question of why should child welfare professionals be concerned about Shoji, what do our other panelists have to offer for that question?
One thing that I would add, not only does this population have negative and adverse outcomes just normally, but when you put that youth then in child welfare, or that young person in child welfare, those outcomes and their representation is a lot greater than I had realized, certainly when I was a caseworker. And really being able to come and lean into these conversations, you know, the estimates are high that about 30.4% of youth in foster care identify as LGB and 5% identify as transgender, compared to 11.2% LGB in the community and 1.17% of youth in the community. And so this is a population that I don't know that we are all aware of, because they may not be comfortable coming out. And so if we're not asking the right questions, if we're not establishing ourselves as caseworkers as affirming, we may not know, and we may be missing some of those key things that could help us to support these youth in different ways.
So this is Pearl. I would also add that that's the overrepresentation in child welfare is really why we've created this best practice guide. So Nicole and I have been working for, well, diligently for several months, but over the past year on this, an affirmed and respected best practices for serving LGBTQ plus children and youth in child welfare. And it's really a repository of best practices for providing safety, permanency, and well-being for LGBTQ plus youth. The aim really is to create and increase cultural competence, humility, and responsiveness of child welfare professionals. And you know, we're really having, it's organized in stages. So based on your casework and experience what you're interested in, you can just jump to the right section. We hope it's going to be coming out sometime in July. There's also a frequently asked questions section with really helpful responses to common questions. So if anybody's interested, definitely reach out. We'll be sharing the best practice guide widely. And if you have any training needs around this topic, we're hoping to be promoting that as well.
Great, thanks.
Hi, this is Theo. One of the things I would say about why we would want to look specifically at sexual orientation and gender identity amongst the children, youth, and families that we serve is that I think sometimes it's really, we want to say things like, it doesn't matter, we love and care for the children, youth, and families, no matter who they are or who they love, we embrace them. But I think, like a lot of other isms like racism and sexism, ableism, we don't really realize the ways in which we affect people subtly and subconsciously unless we focus on it and spend some time really digging into it. I think all of us know not to be consciously outwardly horribly homophobic or transphobic, but if you're a part of the majority, you may sometimes miss the ways that we are following a system that benefits the majority and we perpetuate harm to children, youth, and families. So we have to be able to like look at the specific populations that make up the children, youth, and families that we serve, so that we don't continue to like sweep under the rug their particular needs.
Kristen, we can't hear you.
Of course, sorry. We had a question in the chat asking if we could get those statistics that Nicole had mentioned. So I pasted those in the chat, and if there's I'll defer to Mary Gerlach, our communications guru. If there's a better way, I can get those out in a follow-up email or anything like that. We definitely have a lot of resources, and we're happy to provide those for folks looking for them. And then I see another comment. Some of our youth are still questioning. How do we best support them through this? It's hard enough to be an adolescent, especially with all the contributing factors Marvin mentioned. Anybody want to address that question?
I can. This is KP. So we, I work for Adams County, so I am a caseworker in Adams County, and so oftentimes work with my caseworkers and coach them through how to handle, you know, interacting with our kiddos so that they are respectful. And oftentimes I get questions like this: how do you handle our kiddos who are still questioning? And my answer to them is always to just meet them where they're at. So oftentimes they'll say, well, my kiddo, you know, says one day they want to use these pronouns, and then the next day they want this name, and it's just too much, and I don't know what to do. And my answer always is, you just need to meet them where they are at that very minute. So if they're saying, I'm going by this name and these pronouns, then you use that name and those pronouns. And then in the next meeting, 2 weeks from now, if they're still struggling and trying to figure out where they're landing, and they're saying, this is my name and these are my pronouns, then that's the pronouns you use, and that's the name that you use. And as they figure it out, they'll come to a point where they're able to have those conversations with you if you're engaged with them, respecting where they're at that very moment, and meeting them where they are, and truly being a support to them. I think that obviously LGBTQ competent therapy and support and maybe even a mentor could help them explore that and have someone to bounce ideas off of. But in the moment of how to support them, that is one of the biggest things that I would definitely ask them to do.
Yeah, I agree with KP. I think it's also important to remember how young children actually start to identify with their gender, and they start to notice the differences in gender as they see it. And so it's not uncommon for a young person who may be transgender to be able to say it at that moment. You know, I'm a girl and I'm in a boy body, and those things also need to be treated with respect, meeting them where they're at, ensuring that your nonverbal is really neutral, supportive. All of those things are really key, because it's not just adolescence we're talking about. It really is something that younger children start to identify with and understand and articulate.
We have another comment, and it leads very nicely into the next. Oh, sorry, Theo, go ahead.
Sorry. I would actually also just add to that really quickly. I think it's really important for us to, I think there's a way in which sometimes we can sort of look down on the questioning process and say like they can't make up their mind or something like that about young people. And it's actually, the questioning process is really super important. And I would argue that one of the things I hope for the next generation, I feel like in my generation, we really focused on getting to where people could come out, which is still a struggle in a lot of ways, but like that was the focus, was getting to where people could be out. And I hope for the next generation, they get to like live in curiosity. I don't think any of us arrive at our full understanding of ourselves at 13 or 15 or 17 or whatever stage we expect people to have like decided and outed whatever their sexual orientation and gender identity is. I mean, I think we all continue to grow in our understanding of ourselves and our understanding of how we relate to other people throughout our lives. And I really hope that for young people, we give them the opportunity to question forever. That we give ourselves that opportunity as well to wrestle with seeking what life feels whole and fulfilling. Instead of, we sometimes want like young people to out themselves, and then we're like, okay, now you're lesbian forever. And we don't give them the space to then be like, oh, but I'm also interested in these other people. And we need to, and I would love to just, I hope that we give them the space to question for their whole lives.
Yeah, I love that, Theo. I think that's excellent. I think that, you know, when we talk about labels and we talk about people identifying where they are and who they are, really it's just language, and language does have limits. So being able to allow someone to just be who they are and figure out kind of what their growth path is, whatever that may be, we don't stop growing, and we don't start figuring out who we are in our lives. So I really, really love that. I'm stealing some of that.
And another person in the chat wrote, that is so well said, Theo, thank you. So we have several questions popping up about placement, and the next question we were planning to ask you, our panelists, was about placement. So I'm going to try to consolidate a little bit so you guys can address and respond in a way that makes sense for your experience and your knowledge. So the big overarching question is, how do Shoji, race, and other identities impact children and youth in foster care placement? We got a question in the chat that's a little more specific, so I'm going to go ahead and read that off, so when you're responding you can kind of gauge what it is that you'd like to offer. It says, our agency is a welcoming and inclusive, non-discriminatory agency. We communicate this when speaking with potential foster parents and throughout the certification process. Families who are not willing to be matched with LGBTQ foster youth struggle with this. We educate them that we would respect not matching, quote, LGBTQ youth with their home, but reminding them there is always a possibility a youth may later come out as LGBTQ, at which point, as an agency, we need to know the family's stance on what they would do if that were to happen. We need to ensure a youth's rights will not be violated and that they will remain in a safe and healing home. Do you have any guidance on how to make that clearer for families who may then feel their religious or spiritual rights would then be violated with the child remaining in their home under our guidelines? And then a similar question, knowing that there are children either in or entering foster care in need of a safe placement, how are providers, Shoji, taken into account when considering licensure and a home study? So there's a lot packed in there related to placement, but I'll just let you guys kind of digest that. And placement is a really, it's a really complicated and important concern, and that is why it was our second question. So I really appreciate that, detailed kind of layers that came out in the comments. So thank you for those. Pearl, if you don't mind, I will kick it off with you to talk about placement.
Yeah, I think, professionals really need to consider identity factors when placing youth, and LGBTQ plus identity as well as race. We've been talking a lot about race and intersectionality. LGBTQ youth are more than 7 times likely to be placed in a group or foster home than their straight counterparts. 57% of children in out-of-home care who identify as LGBTQ are youth of color. Youth of color who are LGBTQ plus are more likely to experience multiple placements than youth who don't identify as a person of color. And then once in our system, the youth of color that are LGBTQ tend to remain longer and face greater risk of discrimination and violence compared to their peers. So we definitely know that this is a really important factor in considering placements. And I would say in response to the questions specifically about the home study process, the best practice guide will have a section on this too, but the Colorado highly recommends the Safe Home Study Compendium. Additional, I can't remember what it's called, Nicole, you'll have to spot me on this, but it asks specific questions, again, just like you outlined, the questioner outlined. How would you feel if a young person came out during this process? And as you're absolutely right, young people are placed, so we often don't know their Shoji. We don't know if they're like 3 or 4, if they what their sexual orientation is. We may not know their gender identity and expression. They may not have been in a safe environment to really be able to disclose that. So we need to be very cautious about who we're placing those individuals with. And finding affirming homes is definitely one of the most important things we can do. The state cannot say to you, hey, you have to make sure every single one of your homes is affirming, but I would put that back and say, how would you feel if you placed a young person who had not yet come out in a home that was not affirming, and then they came out and they had to be moved in placements? So I think that this is an essential question in child welfare, and I will kick it to our other panelists to discuss.
I can start. That was my one thing too. Like as children and youth, even as adults, sometimes we don't know what our sexual orientation and gender identities might be the next day or in the future. And from experience, I learned that being gay was bad before I ever knew what being gay even meant. And so our children, whether they grow up to identify as LGBTQ or any other, identity under the big umbrella, when they're placed in unaffirming homes, they're learning very early on that maybe these questions that they have, these feelings that they have, these thoughts that they have are something to hide and to be ashamed of. And I think it's really important. And I used to work in child welfare. I never worked in placement, so I never had that struggle. I worked in with the Chafee independent living program, and so I think what I saw was the repercussions of children who haven't found those permanent safe homes, children who are being exited from foster care without any permanency, whose only lifeline is a program that will teach them some job skills and give them some gift cards till they're 21. And I think that that's why it's so important, because those youth who are pushed out of home after home after home, not only do they not have those supportive families as youth and young people, as they grow into young adulthood, where do these children go home to when they leave college dorms? Where do they go home to, for Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever holidays they celebrate? It's really setting folks up for a lonely life without supports.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that everything that has been said, I completely agree with. I think that when we're putting a kiddo in a non-affirming home, even if they have not come out, or maybe they are, a baby and then they get adopted and then come out later, we oftentimes have parents who come to foster who say, well, I'll just take babies. And so we don't have to worry about that piece. But babies do grow, and they grow into their gender identity, and they grow into their sexual orientation, because we all have this gender identity and we all have a sexual orientation. So they figure that out. And so trying to navigate how do you work with a family who has a child that has all this trauma, and if they are then also traumatizing them with potential non-affirming words or things that are damaging to their self-esteem or even damaging to their mental health, I think that that becomes very, very touchy and very difficult, because we certainly don't want to put our children in homes where they're then re-traumatized by things that are happening in the foster home or the adoptive home. So I think that that becomes a very difficult situation, which is part of why Adams County is kind of confirming that we are working towards having affirming homes, and that is our goal, is to have affirming homes, because we don't know what our kiddos have going on for them, and we want to make sure that we're not then adding trauma to the plate.
So KP, we've had another question about foster parent applicants' religious beliefs, and so I'm curious if, in pursuing the seal and in your experience trying to find affirming homes, have you encountered potential foster or adoptive parents who have attested that there's some conflict with their religious beliefs, and have you had the opportunity to deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have had that come up. And so what we wanted to make sure that we did, and we changed some things that we do, is are we making it clear up front that that's what we're looking for, that we need affirming homes? Are we making it clear from the get-go so that families that are not affirming can coach themselves out and say, okay, Adams County is not for me. I'm going to go, see another agency, or maybe I'm not ready to foster, or whatever it is that's going on for them. So we realized when we had a couple of those families that we were, kind of struggling to come to the same page with, we realized maybe we weren't clear up front. So we completely front loaded our message in our information meetings, in our advertisement for recruitment, and everything that we do, we make it very, very clear that affirming families are a part of what we're looking for, in amongst other things, of course, loving families and, all the other things that we're advertising that we need in our families, right? But this, kind of came onto the list. And then what we also did as part of our work with the SEAL is then added another layer, and we actually have them sign a form with several different items on it. And one of them is that they will be affirming, and that's the expectation. So we make it clear up front before they waste any of their time. So we make it clear up front before they go through training. We make it clear up front before they go through the home study process. And we make it very, very clear that that's what we're looking for. And hopefully families then coach themselves out and determine that this is not the place for them. But we have had those families prior to us beefing up our upfront message. We had families come through that we were definitely at, we couldn't come on the same page with, and we just kind of dealt with that on a case-by-case basis, and really worked with the home study process to weed through what that difficulty was for them and unpack that a little bit. And I think that it is a sticky situation, so we had to handle each family on a case-by-case basis. But at this point, having the message super, super clear up front has really, really helped. And since we made that change several months ago, we haven't had that concern come up again. Families are selecting themselves out of the process with us if they're not in that place.
A couple of things I want to highlight about your response that I think are really noteworthy is one that it sounds like you're really doing what I've heard the Human Rights Campaign refer to as rolling out the welcome mat. So it's that public image that you're projecting, and what you're saying, you're openly saying we are practicing in an affirming manner toward LGBTQ children, youth, and families, and how that really conveys who you are as an agency and who your population is that you serve. So, and another thing I just wanted to highlight that you said was when talking with prospective families, really focusing on affirming behavior. And for the counties who are curious and coming up against these issues of religious rights, I would say this is a very complicated legal question, and so you should ask your county attorneys how to handle that. And there have been some, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case out of Colorado. One of the things that was really highlighted in that case was the open hostility to religion is not okay. And so as an agency, we should have no position on anyone's religion other than that your religion is your religion and you're entitled to that. It's a totally different thing to say that, we want to see affirming behavior than to question someone's religious beliefs. So I just wanted to highlight that aspect of what you shared. I thought was really powerful. Does anyone else want to chime in on that?
I think the only thing I would add, and KP, you talked about some of this, is really leaning into those conversations. Pearl and I had the opportunity to attend the Time to Thrive conference, which is put on by the HRC, and we met this wonderful transgender advocate who had this optimistic take about some of that adversity that he had faced. And he said, you know what, I've never met an individual that when I didn't lean into the conversation and try and build on understanding, that I didn't feel move a little bit towards, understanding and trying to get what it means to be transgender and who I am. And I think that to me was so powerful, because we do this so much in social work, is leaning into those conversations and trying to find, again, those concrete affirming behaviors. If you already have a foster family that you've certified, I think starting there and really asking, can you move one step in this direction, or what's one way you can show that you're affirming, and trying to build on that is a way to maybe bring a foster family that's been great and is struggling, around to a place where they can accept and they can see that human is human.
Yeah, and I'm going to add one more little piece on that. Is part of what we also do is a lot of training with our foster parents. So our upfront, our new foster parents get an entire maybe 4 or 5 hours, probably about almost 5 hours of cultural competency training that includes a hefty amount of racial cultural competence, as well as LGBTQ cultural competence. Apparently I can't say that 5 times fast. So we give a lot of training, and that definitely speaks to the affirming behaviors that we're looking for and the difference between tolerance and affirmation. And so we speak to that quite a bit in our training, and also starting to train our current foster parents to, like you said, Nicole, trying to get them to understand the human element and trying to get them just to move a little bit into a different direction, if we can get them there. So that's part of our steps to do that also.
Thank you all so much for that discussion. Let's see, I'm going to move on to our next question about sexual health. The sexual identity and sexual health are important for all people, especially youth who are going through a lot of developmental changes and establishing their identities. How can child welfare professionals support healthy development for children and youth with diverse identities? And I will add in there, I'm going to assume the answer is no. Is it enough to just send young people to their annual well visit? And if that's not enough, why not?
Oh goodness. Okay. I think one of the places to start is to realize that we often build correlations between someone's sexual orientation or gender, well, their sexual orientation, and therefore what their sexual behaviors will be. And then we assume that certain people with certain sexual orientations therefore do not need complete information. And I see this happen like quite a lot. So we say you have a young person in front of you who is a cis male, and maybe even more specifically, if they identify as a gay cis male, we then therefore assume that they don't need any information about birth control. And so we just sort of stick to certain areas of information, and then in a few years later, same young person is dating a trans man, and now they really do need information about birth control because trans men can become pregnant. And so we often, once we know a person's sexual orientation, we assume they only need a specific set of information, and we really need to be discussing the whole host of information for the whole host of young people. That it's really important that all young people get information about birth control, and that we talk about it. That we talk about birth control outside of it just being about controlling birth. That a lot of people use birth control as a for like hormonal regulation, and in some cases, some trans folks will use birth control as a way to deal with the dysphoria of experiencing menstruation. But there are lots and lots of reasons that people need information about birth control, and it isn't just straight cis women who do. Or similarly, you're getting my dogs coming in and out in the periphery, I'm sorry. Or similarly, information about condoms. We need to be talking about like what specific behaviors put people at risk for specific things, so that they know that if they're engaging in those specific behaviors, what sort of precautions they need to take, instead of linking those behaviors with certain identities. It is not just people with vulvas who have sex with people with vulvas who have oral sex. It is people of all genders and all sexual orientations who have oral sex, and they all deserve information about dental dams and barrier methods. So that's one of the pieces that I would put forth for that question.
Thank you. Others?
Just
I'll ask.
affirm what Theo said, which is, I think it's a theme of today, which is really that we should never assume, right? Young people and adults continue to change over time, and our Shoji will continue to change over time, and our needs continue to change over time. So if somebody is now expressing a new need around something, we should not be surprised that it's a new need. Even though maybe it wasn't a need before. So I think that's just, it's a theme that's coming out in placements. It's a theme that's coming out in our sexual health discussion. It's a theme around the topic in general.
Okay. So another question for all of you. We all have those cases or those things in our professional life, looking back, where we think, if only I knew then what I knew now. So I would like to invite you all to be a little bit vulnerable and share some learning experience in your career that gives you that feeling of, I wish I knew then what I know now.
I can go ahead and start us off. As I mentioned in the first question, as a caseworker, I had no idea how many of the youth that I served were probably identifying as LGBTQ+, and just never told me and never felt comfortable coming forward and reading the youth voice, especially when you look at our crossover population, who, again, when you look at outcomes, are disproportionately represented in a lot of the negative outcomes, talking about pregnancy, talking about homelessness. Those are two huge things, especially homelessness, that LGBTQ+ youth are also overly represented in. And so you have these crashing intersections. I always thought that if I was just genuine enough and if I was just myself, that my youth would just tell me things, right? Like, I was a fun caseworker. Of course they're going to tell me. And I think for some youth that may have been true. And for others, it may not have. And there were opportunities where I could have verbally or non-verbally showed them how affirming I was and showed them that regardless of whatever they were going to tell me, I was ready for it, or leaned into the conversations about sex with my youth, which still to this day is not something that I necessarily want to, talk about with my youth. But that's another staggering statistic. And, the amount of youth that are actually out to their healthcare providers, the one place that we should really be honest about our sexual orientation and when we're having sex and who we're having sex with, a lot of those youth aren't. And so all of these things are things that I wish I had known, so I could have asked the questions more frequently, and maybe one of those times, two of those times, I would have gotten a different answer or a more real answer, or somebody being vulnerable so I could have supported them.
Thanks, Nicole.
I can go next. So I have been in Colorado for over 10 years. I've worked for Adams County for over 10 years, but prior to that, I lived in Georgia. I was raised in Georgia. I worked a good majority of my adult life in Georgia, and my experiences there were very, very different than they were here in Colorado. And one of the things that I learned in my work there in Georgia, and also even transitioning into Colorado and working with HRC, is my voice in advocating for our kiddos. So learning how to do that has been a journey for me. So especially in Georgia, realizing that not everyone has the knowledge that I'm coming from. Not everybody is on the same page starting. And so giving them some understanding prior to getting into kind of riled up advocacy mode, which is what I often did, especially in my younger years in Georgia, getting the comments that come out of people's mouths sometimes, especially when I was working in Georgia, were very difficult to just remember my advocacy skills in. So remembering that education is where I need to start when I'm advocating is something that I have learned, and I'm still learning on how to kind of go on that journey. Is okay, I know I need to advocate, take a deep breath, education comes first. So reminding myself over and over again, education needs to come first, because not everybody is in the same realm or on the same page of the knowledge that I'm coming from. So reminding myself of that over and over again so that they can actually hear what I say has been an important lesson for me.
Thank you.
So I will go next. I actually, so going back in our history, I went to a women's university for undergrad, and I had a lot of friends who came out during that time, and there were jokes about the women there. They would say they're lesbians until graduation, right? They call them lugs, and it was a kind of a theme. But I think that my biggest learning around that is that we don't honor the bisexual experience. There's a lot of myths about a bisexual privilege in our world, and that, oh, well, it's just a phase, or, oh, so if the bisexual person is hanging out with their straight friends and dating a male, that, oh, well, see, they're over their phase of dating women. Or if that person is hanging out with their LGBTQ friends and then they'll be like, oh, well, you can pass, you're passing as a bi person, you can pass as straight, right? So there's this space in between, and the myth of bisexual privilege, where actually people who identify as bisexual are actually face higher disparities than several of the other identities, because they don't feel completely accepted or home with any one group or population. So they're always having to, if you would, code switch between populations. I think that's the same in the intersectionality between people of color and LGBTQ. So, or you know, somebody says, well, you know, I'm hanging out with my gay friends, but they're a person of color, they may not feel completely safe there because there aren't other people of color who identify as LGBTQ. Or the other way around, like in the Black community, oh, well, you don't quite fit in here because maybe you're not, because you're LGBTQ plus. So I think just considering that, you know, we make assumptions about the privilege of certain identities, and we need to really be thinking about those. I wish I would have known that sooner and really considered some of those interactions.
Thanks, Pearl.
I can go next. This one was kind of a hard question for sure. I think for me, what it's taken me many years to realize is the power that I have to change the systems I work in, even when they're very large systems like child welfare or human services. I think it was 2012 or 2013 when I was working in a residential treatment facility. And of course, I had been aware of our LGBTQ youth policy. That's something that has gone over with every staff as they start. But I didn't really see where that policy lacked really for trans and gender nonconforming youth until there was a youth that came to me and said, I'm, you know, at the time I presented as a very butch lesbian. So the queer youth did often come out to me because they just read me as a safe person because of the way I presented. He came to me and he said, I shouldn't be on the girls unit because I'm a boy. And, you know, I didn't know yet what my power was, and even truly what his power was to change that policy for everyone. And we took it step by step by step with some folks fighting us, but for the most part with like a lot of support. What I learned training social workers on working with LGBTQ youth and working with social workers as an LGBTQ person is that most of us want to do it right. We just need to be taught how. We need to be given resources. We need to be given information. We have big love balance and we're in this for a reason. And so just recognize your power, be curious, and soak up that information. And, you know, you're going to use it one day. You never know what a use might be when you turn around, and, you know, what you might be able to pull out of your back pocket to help that you.
Thank you.
As y'all were talking, I feel like with each person, I had this a separate like oof moment where I was like, oh, I have one of those too. And then now I'm like, now wait, which were they? But like, I mean, I think it's hard sometimes to look back and see the things along the way. I think one of the things that comes to mind is that I think for a long time, I would be in classrooms. So when I'm working with young people, I would be teaching, and there'd be times where I was in a classroom where I would have some like really vocal anti-LGBTQ young people in a room, and there would be it would seem to be sort of be like a group of folks who would have, and I was actually talking on a call earlier today about this sort of similar experience. So if anyone was on that call, I'm sorry you're getting a mild repeat, but there would be like I would feel like there was this majority, this room in which like it wasn't safe. And so I would back down somewhat because I was like, I don't feel safe here. And I would back down from standing up, forgetting that like I was the freaking adult in the room and there were young people that weren't safe there. And so I think over time, one of the things that I've learned is that like is to not be bullied by teenagers. Which is hard for me because it's so easy to go back to like young self, but to like to realize that even when you're in a room in which you feel like this room doesn't have queer folks in it, it is not safe. Remember that I'm the adult to make it a safe space, because it does have queer folks in it of some sort, and like I cannot me looking at the room and saying that it doesn't is a huge wrong assumption on my part. So that's something that I've learned, and I continue to work on, because I continue to, when I am in those spaces, I get small, and I've had to learn to, as Marv was saying, like figure out how to step into what power we have and what and the education that people need in order to create change, or sometimes to remind myself the fact that it's difficult doesn't mean that it's wrong. It actually means it's part of the process. And so if something feels uncomfortable, that doesn't mean that I'm doing something wrong. It means that I'm like, we're in the process together, which is important to remember to step into.
Right. Thank you so much, Theo, and each of you for sharing your growth. The purpose for that question and for ending on that question, if you didn't already infer this, is to illustrate that we are all growing all the time, and it is okay to learn and change and have our past selves not be as enlightened as our present and future selves. And hopefully we will, you know, continue to learn and do better as a profession and as individuals. I do want to acknowledge there's been a few more questions in the chat about more about certification, in particular with religious beliefs. And so I want to again encourage you to talk to your county attorney, because I think they are the ones that need to give you the authoritative answer on how to handle those really specific questions about competing or evidently competing legal rights. And also, please feel free to reach out to us, and we can offer any resources that we have available. I want to conclude with saying thank you all so much for participating. Thank you so much to our panelists for being brave and being present for this conversation. I really appreciate you guys. And we will end it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.